So hi, this is going to be the first of a two-part series on Docker and microservices. And we are covering this because in the last 3 to 5 years, the use of Docker or microservices has been very prominent in various tech companies such as Netflix or in Google, YouTube. If you're entering the workforce in about 1 to 2 years' time, I think it's really pertinent that you get exposed and acquainted with Docker as soon as you can. By the by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to do this, which is deploy a WordPress website on localhost. What you're seeing on the screen right now is the WordPress website that is deployed on localhost. This is the admin panel. In order to achieve this, you will need to deploy two containers. So one which is the WordPress container and the other one which is the MySQL container. You will also learn how to connect and link them up together. So without further ado, we'll get on with Docker fundamentals. So this will be the content for this lecture. We will first cover the difference between monolithic and microservices. And to make let everybody start from the same ground, we'll talk a bit about what Docker exactly is. And the example that I showed earlier, that of deploying of WordPress on your local host, we will be covering that, and we'll use the example to illustrate the different commands, the basic commands in Docker. So I reckon that rather than going through the commands one by one, we'll illustrate these with an example of deploying a WordPress in order to make it a bit more interesting and intuitive. So we'll begin with a comparison between the monolithic and microservices. So on the left, you have what a monolithic architecture normally looks like. You normally have a single user interface, a single business logic data interface, and a single database. So typically, there is just one single code base, and any updates that you need to do have got to be done in a very controlled fashion. Your builds may take up to hours in order to build, and because of that, you tend not to deploy very often. You compare with the microservice architecture that you see on the right, you may still have the same user interface, but in this case, the user interface connects up to various different independent microservices, and each microservice it's likely that they may even have their own database, and because of that, it is very easy to spin off various microservices in order to support your application. Your deployment or even revision of your codes, they may take minutes or even down to seconds, and because of that, it is very often that people on the microservice architecture, they will keep on revising or improving on their code. And because it makes code revision and updates so much easier and faster, it tends to decrease the time that it takes to build, the time that it takes to develop, and the time that it takes to debug. And these are all factors that actually help to complement why microservices are so popular right now. And this is a comparison again of what I just said earlier. So for monolithic architecture, it is normally single tiered. You single deployment of the entire code base. You have a single runtime, single code base, and the interaction between classes is most commonly synchronous. So this is the some of the factors or rather common features of that of a monolithic architecture. For microservice, you normally consist of smaller modules or components, and each individual module component is only responsible for its own specific functionality. And because of that, every single module or component will have its own code base. Every single component or module will have its own separate deployment, its own database, and they are independent. So it really solves a very big problem. So imagine if you have if you have two different components, one component running on Python 2.7, the other component running on Python 3, in order for both of them to coexist together in a monolithic architecture, it can be really challenging at times. But for microservice architecture, they can just be deployed in two different containers, and then both of the so-called modules will then run their respective Python dependencies on their own containers. And you just need to be able to set up how each container talks to one another, and then your microservice architecture will then be able to work. So this is an example of why microservice architecture has been so popular over the last few years. It really allows you to have very different so-called very different dependencies that can coexist together in a single application. Another common question that often comes out is, what is the difference between virtual machines and microservice or Docker? So I put here a very simple diagram that depicts it. So for virtual machines, they are a bit more heavyweight, although they generally they sit on top of a host operating system, similarly to Docker. But for virtual machines, each of the virtual machine hosts their own OS, and because of that, they're generally a lot heavier than their Docker counterparts. So for Docker, instead of their own virtual machine, it sits on something that they call the Docker daemon, and which also makes use of the hypervisor. But in general, it is a lot more lightweight as compared to the virtual machine counterparts.